days before this moment, Eloy Room was the goalkeeper who shipped 7 goals in a World Cup opener and gave the entire football world a reason to stop paying attention to him. Tonight, in the 89th minute, with the scoreboard still reading nothing against one of South America's most dangerous attacks, the broadcast graphic flashes a number that makes commentators stop mid-sentence. 16 saves, a World Cup record for a match that never needed extra time to get there. The goalkeeper raising both arms in Kansas City isn't a rising star. He's 37 years old. He plays his club football in America's second-tier league, a division most fans outside the United States couldn't name if you asked them, and he just spent 90 minutes single-handedly keeping the smallest nation ever to qualify for a World Cup alive in the tournament. This is not a story about talent nobody saw. Everybody in Curaçao's football program has known exactly what Eloy Room could do for over a decade. This is a story about what it takes for the rest of the world to notice a goalkeeper who has spent his entire career one tier below the spotlight, and what happens in the 8 days between the worst result of a career and the best one. Rewind a year, and almost nothing about this story looks inevitable. Curaçao had never played a single minute of World Cup football. Eloy Room had never started a match on a stage bigger than an MLS Cup final or a regional CONCACAF qualifier, the kind of games that matter enormously to the people involved and barely register anywhere else. There was no obvious trajectory pointing toward a night like this one. No breakout season, no transfer to a bigger club that signaled a career on the rise. If you had described this exact night to a football analyst 12 months earlier, the most likely response wouldn't have been disbelief. It would have been a polite question about which 2 players you'd actually meant to combine into one improbable story. Let's start with what Eloy Room actually is on paper, because the gap between that and what he did on the pitch is the whole story. Room was born in Nijmegen, in the Netherlands, in February 1989. He qualifies for Curaçao through his father, a Dutch Caribbean island nation of roughly 150,000 people, and he made the decision early in his career to commit to that flag instead of chasing a longer shot at Dutch youth honors. He joined the Vitesse Academy in Arnhem at 13 years old and spent the better part of 15 years orbiting that club, with detours that tell you everything about how a goalkeeping career like this actually goes. A breakthrough loan spell at Go Ahead Eagles, cut short midway through the season because Vitesse needed him back to cover an injury to their own backup. Years split between starting and benched at Vitesse itself. A stint at PS5 Eindhoven during an Eredivisie title-winning campaign, mostly watching from the goalkeeping depth chart rather than commanding the position. A move to Major League Soccer with Columbus Crew in 2019, where he became a genuine first-choice starter for the first extended stretch of his career and won an MLS Cup in 2020. Then back to Vitesse in 2023, released a year later when the club's well-documented financial problems forced a squad overhaul. A short stop at Belgium's Cercle Brugge, and finally, in December 2025, a contract with Miami FC of the USL Championship, the United States Second Division, signed less than 6 months before the biggest tournament in the sport. By any market valuation that gets attached to a player's name, this is not the resume of a World Cup hero. Transfer data services list his value anywhere from roughly 80,000 to 200,000 euros depending on which provider you check, a modest figure even by the standards of a journeyman goalkeeper, and a fraction of what most starting World Cup goalkeepers carry into the tournament. He is, by every conventional measure the football industry uses to rank a player, exactly what he looks like on paper. A well-traveled, reliable, unspectacular professional in the back half of his career, playing in a league most of the planet has never watched a single minute of. Break that career down year by year, and the pattern is the same one that defines almost every goalkeeper who never quite becomes a household name. At Vitesse, he was never simply handed the gloves. He broke into the first team in 2010 only after the Club's incumbent left for Spain, lost his place again during a loan spell elsewhere, came back, lost it again to injury timing and squad politics, and didn't fully establish himself as a clear first choice until years into his 20s at a mid-table Dutch club that itself spent most of that era fighting against bigger spenders rather than challenging for titles. The PSV move on paper looks like a high point, an Eredivisie championship medal, won at one of the most successful clubs in Dutch football history. In practice, it was a deeper step into the background, a squat goalkeeper role behind a more established number one, the kind of medal that sits in a cabinet without ever translating into a reputation. Even his genuine high point, the move to Major League Soccer and an MLS Cup with Columbus Crew in 2020, happened in a league that, for all its growth, still doesn't carry the same global weight as Europe's major divisions in the eyes of the algorithms that set a player's market price. Every time Room's career touched something resembling real recognition, it touched it from one step removed. What that valuation doesn't capture is what Room actually means to Curaçao's national team. Here's the context that number needs, because most viewers outside the United States have no real frame of reference for what it means to be a starting goalkeeper in the USL Championship. It sits one full tier below Major League Soccer, which itself sits well below the major European leagues in global prestige and broadcast reach. Matches are played in front of crowds that can dip into the low thousands. Wages, even for established veterans, are a fraction of what a backup goalkeeper earns at a mid-table Premier League club. It is, in the football world's own internal hierarchy, treated as a place careers wind down rather than a place World Cup history gets written. For a 37-year-old to step out of that environment and produce the single most statistically dominant goalkeeping performance of an entire World Cup tournament isn't just an upset, it's close to a structural impossibility. The kind of results the sport's own data models would have assigned a vanishingly small probability if you'd asked them the week before it happened. He is the joint most capped player in the country's history, sharing that distinction with teammate Leandro Bacuna. With well over 60 international appearances stretched across more than a decade of unglamorous qualifying campaigns, nobody outside the Caribbean and Central American football world was watching. He was in goal for Curaçao's run to the 2017 Caribbean Cup title, in goal for their 2019 Gold Cup quarterfinal breakthrough, and in goal, most critically, on the night in November 2025, when a clean sheet against Jamaica sealed something no one connected to Curaçao football had any right to expect. A first ever World Cup qualification for a nation of 150,000 people, smaller than most World Cup stadiums could hold if you tried. That qualification alone was already a historic achievement before a ball had been kicked at the tournament itself. Curaçao had never come remotely close to a World Cup before. The island's entire footballing infrastructure runs on a fraction of the budget that mid-tier European academies spend on a single age group. And for most of the country's footballing history, qualification for anything beyond regional Caribbean competition was treated as an aspiration rather than a realistic target. To put the population context in perspective, Curaçao's roughly 150,000 residents would fit inside a single mid-sized World Cup stadium more than once over, with room to spare. Most of the nations they shared a pitch with in this tournament have youth academy systems alone with more registered players than Curaçao has total citizens. Room was the constant through every painstaking step of that climb, present for the disappointments as much as the eventual breakthrough, never the headline name in a wider regional narrative that for years focused on bigger CONCACAF programs assumed to have a far easier path to the tournament than a Dutch Caribbean island most football fans couldn't place on a map. Then the tournament started, and for one match, it looked like the story might end almost almost as fast as it began. Curaçao's World Cup opener was against Germany, four-time champions, a squad that outclassed them in almost every measurable way. The final score was 7-1. Not a narrow defeat dressed up as a moral victory, a genuine public, statistically brutal beatdown, the kind of scoreline that gets replayed in highlight packages as a cautionary tale about the gap between a debutant nation and the sport's traditional powers. Room conceded 7 times in a single 90 minutes on the biggest stage of his career, at 37 years old, in what was likely going to be his only World Cup appearance ever. If this story had ended there, nobody would have written about him at all, except as a footnote in someone else's highlight reel. It didn't end there. 6 days later, Curaçao faced Ecuador, a side ranked dramatically higher and expected to brush past a team still reeling from its opening humiliation. Almost nobody outside Curaçao's own camp expected anything different from the script that had just been written against Germany. From the 3rd minute, that script tore itself up. Ecuador's Ener Valencia broke clear on goal early, the kind of one-on-one chance that decides matches before they've properly started, and Room got down to deny him a save that on its own would have been the highlight of most goalkeepers' tournaments. 17 minutes later, Valencia was through again, one-on-one for a second time, and again Room got across his line in time to smother the chance before it could become a headline of its own. The pattern that was supposed to define this match, a debutant nation getting steadily worn down by a far superior attack, kept refusing to arrive. By the second half, Ecuador had shifted from probing to outright bombarding the Curaçao goal, forcing stop after stop, point-blank saves on Gonzalo Plata in the 59th minute, on Valencia again 6 minutes later, on substitute Kevin Rodriguez in the 66th, 3 more genuine goal-scoring opportunities inside a single 7-minute spell, the kind of sustained pressure that statistically should produce at least 1 or 2 goals against a tired, undermanned underdog defense. Playing its second match in less than a week, it produced 0. By full time, FIFA's own matchday data credited Room with 16 saves, a figure that ties the all-time men's World Cup record set by American goalkeeper Tim Howard against Belgium in 2014, with one notable difference. Howard's 16 came across a full match plus 30 minutes of extra time, while Room reached the same number inside 90 regulation minutes alone, statistically the busiest, most decisive 90-minute goalkeeping performance the tournament has ever recorded. Some independent data providers logged the tally at 15 rather than 16, depending on how a single deflected effort gets classified, but by any count, what happened in Kansas City that night sits among the handful of greatest individual goalkeeping displays in World Cup history. The match finished 0-0. For Curaçao, a goalless draw against a heavily favored opponent wasn't a disappointment. It was a landmark. It was the first point the smallest nation ever to play in a World Cup had earned on the biggest stage that exists, and it kept their improbable run toward the knockout rounds technically alive heading into their final group match. Room was named player of the match, becoming the first Curaçaoan player in history to receive that honor at a World Cup. His own teammates, several of whom had watched him absorb criticism after the Germany result without complaint, were among the first to make the point that what the rest of the world was discovering for the first time, the dressing room had known for years. Captain Leandro Bacuna, who has played alongside Room for the better part of a decade, made the point afterward that Room's recent form had actually been shaky before that night, having shipped goals in bunches across Curaçao's previous warm-up matches, and that the Ecuador performance wasn't a fluke so much as a top-class goalkeeper simply having everything click at once on the one night it mattered most. Winger Tahith Chong, the only Curaçao-born player in the entire squad, put it even more simply. The rest of the world might be seeing it for the first time, but nobody inside that camp was remotely surprised by what Room was capable of. Head coach Dick Advocaat, a manager who has overseen major national teams across multiple decades of European football, admitted afterward, half joking, that he had genuinely never seen Room play at that level before. His opposite number that evening, Ecuador's own goalkeeper, made a point of finding room after the final whistle specifically to tell him the performance was one of the finest he'd ever witnessed from the other end of a pitch. Room himself, asked afterward to put the night in context, joked that Curacao might need to start planning a statue. It's the kind of throwaway line that only lands because of what came before it. 8 days earlier, after conceding 7 goals to Germany, nobody on the planet was discussing monuments. They were discussing whether a 37-year-old playing in America's second tier deserved to start Curaçao's next match at all. What Room produced that night sits inside a real recognizable lineage in this sport, one that World Cup seemed to produce almost every cycle. The goalkeeper from the smaller footballing nation who, for 90 minutes, becomes the entire reason a result that shouldn't be possible actually happens. Costa Rica's Keylor Navas built an entire World Cup legend in 2014 on exactly this kind of defiance. Mexico's Guillermo Ochoa has done it more than once, a decade apart, against attacks that on paper should have overwhelmed him. Trinidad and Tobago's Shaka Hislop, the last Caribbean goalkeeper to manage anything close to what Room just did, wasn't even his country's first choice keeper heading into their own World Cup appearance, thrown in only after a late injury to the player who was actually supposed to start. Room's name now sits inside that same tradition, next to goalkeepers most casual football fans actually remember by name from tournaments most casual football fans actually watched. A tradition built almost entirely by players representing nations the sport's financial structures were never designed to take seriously in the first place. Here's where this story refuses to give you the ending the format usually demands. Curaçao did not advance to the knockout stage. 3 days after the Ecuador miracle, they faced an Ivory Coast side that only needed a draw to qualify and instead beat them comfortably 2-0, eliminating the debutants from the tournament at the group stage. The match started badly and stayed that way. Inside 7 minutes, a defensive mistake led Yan Diomande in down the left, and his cutback was finished from close range to put Curaçao behind almost before the nerves had settled. They pushed for an equalizer in patches, a long-range effort from Tahith Chong, the closest they came to troubling the scoreboard, but a second goal just past the hour mark, slotted home after a defense-splitting pass through the heart of their backline, ended any realistic hope of a response. There was no fairy tale knockout run, no giant killing sequel. Curaçao's first ever World Cup ended exactly where the form table said it probably would, with one historic point salvaged from 3 matches against vastly more resourced opposition. It's worth saying plainly that Curaçao wasn't even the only debutant nation producing this kind of story across this exact tournament. This is a World Cup where Cape Verde, another tiny nation with a fraction of the resources of football's traditional powers, drew with Spain in their own group stage opener, a result that on its own would have sounded implausible a year earlier. Across this expanded 48-team field, the gap between football's wealthiest programs and its smallest ones has narrowed in ways that the sport's own financial models still haven't fully caught up to. Room's record-tying performance against Ecuador isn't an isolated miracle. It's one entry in a wider pattern this entire tournament has been writing in real time, of small football nations refusing to play the role the budget sheets assigned them. That ending matters because it's the honest one, and honesty is what makes the rest of this story worth telling at all. Eloy Room didn't get a storybook trophy lift. He didn't parlay one legendary night into a permanent rewrite of his career trajectory the way a younger player might have. He's 37, his Miami FC contract runs through the end of this calendar year, and by the time you're watching this, he's likely already back in the USL Championship, playing in front of crowds a fraction of the size that watched him in Kansas City, for a market value that almost certainly hasn't moved by much in either direction. There is no documented sponsorship windfall here, no agent fielding calls from elite European clubs overnight. A 37-year-old goalkeeper from the second tier of American soccer was never going to be treated by the market the same way a 23-year-old breakout star would be, no matter how historic the performance. That's not a detail this story should soften or skip past. It's the part of the story that makes the rest of it matter more, not less. What did change, and what no scoreline against Ivory Coast can take back, is smaller and in some ways more permanent than a transfer fee or a knockout run would have been. For one night, the most statistically dominant goalkeeping performance of an entire World Cup belonged to a player nobody outside Curaçao's own football federation had any reason to know existed a week earlier. The record books now carry his name next to Tim Howard's, a goalkeeper most casual fans actually do remember, from a tournament most casual fans actually did watch. 150,000 people got a piece of footballing history attached permanently to their tiny island. Built entirely on the back of a goalkeeper, the rest of the sport had filed under unremarkable for the better part of 2 decades. Back home, a nation that has spent its entire footballing existence watching bigger countries play in tournaments it could only qualify for in theory now has a concrete answer to the question of what it actually looks like when that theory becomes real, and the answer has his name attached to it permanently in FIFA's own official record books, whether or not the team ever qualifies again. Here's the part of this story that doesn't need a financial mechanism explained to you in dollar figures, because the value isn't sitting in a bank account or a sponsorship deal. It's sitting in the fact that for the rest of his life, Eloy Room is no longer just a well-traveled backup who bounced between leagues nobody important was watching. He is the goalkeeper who matched a World Cup record built by one of the position's most recognized modern names on the biggest stage in the sport at an age when most goalkeepers in his exact career bracket are coaching youth teams rather than making history. Nobody handed him that. Not Vitesse, who loaned him out and brought him back and loaned him out again over 15 mostly unheralded years. Not PSV, where a title medal sat in his locker while someone else started in goal. Not the market value algorithms that, as recently as this season, priced him as a replaceable low six-figure squad option. He earned it across 6 days in June, the same way he earned every appearance before it, by showing up to a position nobody glamorizes, doing the unglamorous job, and being ready on the one night out of a 15-year career when the entire football world happened to finally be watching. There's a version of this profession where a goalkeeper in Room's exact position, 37 years old, second division, 3 full divisions removed from the spotlight, simply stops believing a night like this is still possible. The data would have backed that decision up completely. Nothing in his recent club form, nothing in his market valuation, nothing in the algorithms read of his career trajectory suggested a record-tying World Cup performance was sitting somewhere ahead of him. He kept training like it was anyway, for reasons that have nothing to do with what any spreadsheet could have told him to expect. It's worth sitting with how narrow the window actually was. Not a season, not a tournament, one single match, sandwiched between a 7-goal humiliation and a group stage elimination that arrived just 3 days later. Most careers don't get a window that small to make their entire case. Most goalkeepers who get a window that small don't walk through it. Room did, on the one night out of 15 years of professional football when the margin for error against him was supposed to be largest, not smallest, and the result was the opposite of what every reasonable prediction said should happen. You are watching this for a reason. Somewhere, a market is putting a modest number on you too. A job title, a salary band, a league nobody important is scouting, a verdict about what stage of your career you're supposedly in and what's realistically still possible from here. Eloy Room's number, right up until 8 days before the biggest night of his career, was a journeyman fee in America's second division, attached to a player most of the football world had quietly stopped paying attention to. He didn't get a fairy tale ending. Curacao still went home. The number on his contract still hasn't moved much either way. What he got was something smaller and arguably more honest. Proof on the record in front of the entire planet for exactly 90 minutes that the number was never the whole story and that it was never too late to spend one more night proving it. Follow for the next story because the next goalkeeper, striker, or unranked nobody about to rewrite what the world thought it knew about them is already out there waiting for their own 90 minutes.